Millstone Cemetery had always been whispered about in hushed tones, its name carrying an aura of dread that clung to the town like a thick fog. As a child, I had heard the rumors, stories about the Wright family, whose graveyard was cursed by their dark past. Some said that the cemetery was cursed because of an unspeakable crime committed by the family long ago. Others believed the spirits of the Wrights still roamed the land, seeking vengeance for whatever wrong had been done to them. No one could ever explain it exactly, but the warnings were clear. Don't go near Millstone Cemetery, especially after dark. For most of my life, I brushed these stories aside. As an urban explorer, I was drawn to places like this, abandoned, decayed, forgotten by time. The thrill of discovering something hidden from the world, something left behind, was irresistible to me. So when my friend Taylor suggested we explore Millstone Cemetery one October evening, I didn't hesitate. The town's warnings only fueled my curiosity. If the place was truly haunted, I wanted to see it for myself. We gathered our gear, flashlights, cameras, and an old map we'd found online that marked the cemetery's location. It was a chilly evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting an orange glow that quickly faded as night took over. The woods surrounding the cemetery were thick and unwelcoming, but we pressed on. Our footsteps crunched on the overgrown path as we made our way deeper into the trees. The air grew heavier, more oppressive with each step, and the faint sounds of wildlife slowly faded away. It was as if the woods themselves held their breath. The cemetery appeared in front of us like a forgotten relic, its gravestones leaning at odd angles, half buried in the earth. Most of the names had faded with time, but the Wright family plot stood out, more solemn and imposing than the others. The tombstones around were darker, whether by age, but still imposing. The air seemed to vibrate with something ancient, something bitter. I could almost feel the weight of the place pressing in on me, but there was no turning back now. We made our way to the heart of the cemetery, where a large stone mausoleum loomed in the distance, its jagged outline cut against the sky like a scar on the earth. This was it, the Wright family mausoleum. I had heard stories about this place, how it had been abandoned for decades, sealed off by rusted gates and overgrown vines. Some said that the family had been buried here, locked away for eternity, but no one really knew for sure. I wondered, as we approached the mausoleum, what secrets it might hold. Taylor and I hesitated at the entrance, our flashlights flickering slightly in the cold night air. The heavy iron door creaked as we pried it open, revealing the darkness within. The stench of dampness and rot hit us immediately. The air was thick with age and neglect. I stepped inside first, my heart racing with both fear and excitement. Taylor followed closely behind, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The interior of the mausoleum was vast, the walls lined with old, cracked stone, cobwebs draped from the ceiling, and the ground was uneven, covered in a thick layer of dust. The air felt colder than it had outside, as though the temperature dropped by several degrees the moment we entered. I could feel a strange heaviness in my chest, like the air itself was thick with sorrow and anger. As I explored, I found an old journal lying discarded on the floor. It was covered in dust and age, but the pages were still intact. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it, scanning the pages quickly. The journal belonged to a woman named Eleanor Wright, the last living member of the Wright family. Her writings were filled with bitterness and pain, describing how she had been wronged by her own relatives, how they had betrayed her, and how she had been left to die alone in this very mausoleum. As I read aloud to Taylor, the temperature in the room plummeted. "Something's not right," Taylor muttered, his voice low and uneasy. I didn't answer, too absorbed in the journal's chilling words. Eleanor's final entry spoke of revenge, how she would never rest until she had made her family pay for what they had done to her. It ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. Suddenly, the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the stone walls, and for a moment, I thought I might faint from the shock. We turned around, but there was no sign of anyone. The door was locked, and no matter how hard we pushed, it wouldn't budge. Then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind brushing through the trees. But they grew louder, clearer, more urgent. I could hear a voice a woman's voice filled with anger and sorrow. "Get out! Get out of my grave!" The temperature in the mausoleum dropped even further, and I could see my breath in front of me, puffing out in white clouds. Taylor's eyes widened in fear, and I could see the terror creeping into his face. We both turned toward the far corner of the room, where a shadow began to take shape. The air seemed to shimmer as the figure materialized, growing more solid with every passing second. It was a woman, her pale face twisted in a grotesque expression of rage and pain. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her skin was stretched tight over her bones, as though she had been dead for years. The air around her crackled with energy, like a storm was about to break. She was coming for us. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The woman's hands reached out toward us, her long, skeletal fingers curling as she drew closer. Her voice grew louder, her demands more desperate. "Leave me be. Leave me to rest." We stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. The door was still locked. There was no escape. "Run!" Taylor screamed. I snapped out of my trance and grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. But as we reached it, something yanked me back. Taylor's scream filled the air as he was dragged to the ground, the woman's icy grip seizing his leg. I could feel the weight of her presence behind me, her cold breath against my neck. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned and grabbed Taylor's arm, yanking him free from her grasp. We both stumbled toward the door, and with a desperate push, I managed to force it open. The moment we were through, I slammed it shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the town. Neither of us spoke as we made our way home, the fear still gripping us. But when we heard the story of Eleanor Wright, it all clicked into place. Her spirit, bound by the rage and betrayal she had endured, had never found peace. She was still seeking vengeance, her anger so powerful that it could trap anyone who dared enter her domain. We made a silent pact that night never to speak of what had happened. But I couldn't forget the vengeful face of Eleanor Wright, her eyes burning with fury. Even now, I can feel her presence lingering in the air, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter the cursed grounds of Millstone Cemetery. I can still hear her whispers, growing louder each time I close my eyes. In the sleepy town of Drybrook, there stood an old cemetery that had long been forgotten by the living. The weathered gravestones were overgrown with ivy, and many had eroded with time. The air carried an unnerving stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the soft cooing of distant birds. For as long as I could remember, I'd always found the place unsettling, and when I inherited the old mansion from my estranged relative, Sylvia, I had no choice but to accept the strange ties that bound me to Drybrook. There was something in the air here, something oppressive, as if the land itself harbored secrets long buried, unwilling to let go. The mansion itself was grand, a relic from a time long past, but its charm was overshadowed by the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone within its walls. The old house groaned with age, its floors creaking underfoot as if trying to warn me, but nothing felt more unnerving than the cemetery behind it. At first, I only glanced at it from the mansion's large windows, feeling a curiosity gnaw at me. The gravestones, many cracked and leaning, seemed to have a life of their own, and though the cemetery was clearly abandoned, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. I avoided the place as best I could, but the mansion was vast, and its cold, lonely halls offered little comfort. My loneliness in the empty house drove me to explore the grounds, and soon the cemetery began to draw me in like a moth to a flickering light. I knew it was wrong to be there, but I couldn't resist. One evening, as dusk settled and the sky bled into deep purples and blues, I found myself out there with my camera, taking photographs of the gravestones. I told myself it was a harmless way to occupy my mind, to focus on the beauty of decay. But there was something strange in the air that evening. The wind, though soft, carried with it an unspoken warning, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally long. As I clicked the shutter, my camera flashed repeatedly, though there was no one in frame. No one, except for the gravestones and overgrown ivy. But the camera insisted. Flash after flash, like the light was trying to tell me something, urging me to look closer. Curious, I reviewed the pictures on my camera screen, my stomach tightening with unease as I scrolled through the images. The first few pictures were normal. Landscapes of the cemetery, close-ups of weathered stones, the details of rusted iron gates. But then, there was one photo that made my blood run cold. Sylvia's face, gaunt and pale, appeared by her gravestone. Her eyes were wide, as if in shock or pain, her mouth slightly open in a silent scream that seemed to freeze the air around me. I dropped the camera, feeling my heart race in my chest. There was no way I could have taken that photo. Sylvia had died years ago, hadn't she? With trembling hands, I picked the camera back up. In the subsequent photos, she appeared again, this time standing closer, just a few feet away from the gravestone, her face now twisted in anger. The images were clear, and her presence, though ghostly, was undeniable. It wasn't just the camera malfunctioning. Something was wrong in that cemetery, and Sylvia was somehow involved. I had to see it for myself. The following day, I returned to the cemetery in the daylight. The morning fog hung low over the ground, a thick mist that obscured the gravestones, adding to the sense of mystery. My footsteps felt heavy, like the earth was trying to hold me back, but I pressed on, drawn towards Sylvia's grave. The ground seemed colder here, the shadows deeper, as if the sun could not penetrate the weight of the spirits that lingered. I stood before the gravestone, staring down at the faded engraving of her name, Sylvia. The wind began to pick up, swirling around me like an unseen presence. It ruffled my hair and tugged at my clothes, carrying with it a voice, a whisper that cut through the chill. You shouldn't have come. I froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was Sylvia's voice. The air grew even colder, sharp enough to make my breath visible in the mist. The ground beneath me trembled, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. I stumbled back, but before I could move further, the ground cracked open with a loud, horrifying sound. The earth split wide, like a mouth opening, and from the depths emerged a form. No, a specter, a figure shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It dragged itself from the earth, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a thing not meant to walk. And then I saw her, Sylvia. She stood before me, her face twisted in fury. Her eyes were no longer those of the innocent young woman I remembered from my childhood. They burned with an ancient rage, a burning vengeance that seeped into my very soul. Her form flickered like smoke in the wind, yet her presence felt all too real, all too tangible. Her voice was a rasp, an echo of the wind itself. I was wronged, she said, her words like a cold slap against my skin. And now you will pay. The ground cracked open wider, and before I could move, the earth beneath me gave way. The cemetery was no longer just a place of rest for the dead. It was a prison, a trap for those who dared enter. I felt myself being pulled downward, my body dragging against the dirt as though invisible hands gripped me tightly. I struggled, but there was no escaping. The cemetery had claimed me, just as it had claimed others before me. Around me, the cemetery erupted with shadowy figures, rising from their graves like forgotten souls returning to the land of the living. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, mouths open in agony, their bodies covered in earth and decay. They reached out with clawed hands, their cold fingers grazing my skin as they pulled me deeper into the earth. Sylvia stood above me, watching as the shadows swarmed around us. You should never come, she whispered again, her voice now lost in the cacophony of the dead. The cemetery will never let you leave. And as the ground swallowed me whole, as the darkness closed in around me and the vengeful spirits of forgotten claimed my soul, I understood, too late, that some places should never be visited, and some spirits should never be awakened. The cemetery of lost souls would always claim those who dared to trespass, and I was now one of them, a forgotten face in the endless sea of the damned.